All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar where I'll be talking about learning by teaching, which is a very, very effective teaching strategy, one of my favorites, and something that is an important strategy to have part of your teaching repertoire, to have a part of your bag of tricks, so to speak. Now, you won't use learning by teaching all the time. It's not something that you do on a daily basis. It's not something you'll even do on a weekly basis, but it is, well, maybe you will, but generally speaking, learning by teaching is one of those strategies that are better done once a month or once every couple of months in a standard class. Sometimes there are programs where you'll have an older student helping out a younger student, or there is a specific reason why you'll be doing some type of learning by teaching on a weekly basis. But generally speaking, it's one of those strategies that you use in a more sparse sort of way to make sure that it keeps that effectiveness and that students enjoy doing it. Now, obviously there are exceptions to that, and here's a list of some of them. Learning by teaching goes by various different names, so I tried to think of a few that I've seen in the past, and it's generally got this word peer at the start, and the first one I've got is modelling. Peer modelling is quite often used when you have an individual, usually an individual student who is selected to help another student, normally to pair them up so that the student who is having behavioural problems or some type, usually it's a behavioural issue, learns by just casually observing the student that they're paired with. So that normally is spoken about in terms of, say, a student with a neurological disability working with a student who does not have a disability, and the idea is that appropriate behaviours can be taught through some type of modelling process. Now, quite often the students won't even know that they're engaged in peer modelling. It's a strategy that teachers just use by pairing students together. Sometimes the student who is modelling the appropriate behaviour will be aware of it. But anyway, we're getting a little off track. Learning by teaching, I'm more so referring to probably this one at the bottom, which is peer teaching. And that's an actual student, say in your class or whatever, teaching another student. Now, that can happen if you're a teacher and you want to separate your students out into pairs, for example, and you can have one student that teaches another student for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever, then they can swap over. You can have students who do a bit of research on a particular topic, or another half the students or a group of students concentrate on a certain area, and then because they've both done a bit of work or they're a bit more knowledgeable than their other half or the other group or the other student they're paired with, then they can swap over. So one group can teach this group and then this group can teach that group and so on and so forth. So that's a couple of different ways in which peer teaching can work. If you're teaching students with ADHD or any of those students who like to be the centre of attention, who have behavioural issues for whatever reason, very extroverted students, whether they have ADHD or not, peer teaching is a really good strategy, particularly if you can get that student, particularly if that student has an area of expertise or an area of interest. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're an expert and they're standing in front of the class teaching the whole class, although you can do that and that does work, but you can usually get them to work as something of a teacher assistant. So they're helping the teacher by scribing things on the board and so on and so forth. And that's a way of directing their need to have that centre of attention or to be getting out of their seat and doing something, to be having that movement in a way that's acceptable and so that they're not getting in trouble or interrupting the class in some other way. So peer teaching can be useful in those ways. There's also a couple of other types, peer mentoring and peer tutoring. They can be they're basically almost very similar. Mentoring is more along the lines of an older student helping a younger student or a more experienced student in a particular area, whatever that may be, helping a student who is less experienced. And tutoring is more about a specific academic type subject, maths or science or something like that. So there are a few different models of learning by teaching that you might come across. I don't really use any of those terms. I use this term here, learning by teaching. And so I don't think it's really necessary to work out specifically which one of these that you're going to use. so long as you're following some of the basic principles or the basic, I guess you want to call them rules, although there are, I guess, lots of exceptions, but some of the basic rules around why you use certain strategies, and that's making sure that it's age appropriate, there are clear goals, students are working towards their goals, you're using a range of motivation strategies, you're using some scaffolds and so on and so forth. So provided you're going through those normal processes about what makes best practice as far as teaching strategies are concerned, then I don't think this really matters. All this really, the only reason I just put these up is just so that if you do see these terms, you know that basically they're just referring to some version of learning by teaching. Okay, so I just wanted to go through, I think it's relatively obvious how to do learning by teaching. You have one student who teaches another student, and you can integrate that into various different lessons as pair work or even small group work or whatever. And there's a range of different ways that you can do that. Obviously, it's going to work with some groups and it might not work with others. So unlike, say, explicit instruction or whole part whole learning or any of those other strategies that just apply across the board, learning by teaching is not always going to be useful or effective. So you have to just be careful about applying it only under certain circumstances. And you'll get a gut instinct for when it's appropriate to use these types of strategies and when it's not appropriate to use these types of strategies. But like if anything that we do in the education sort of world, if it doesn't work, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be honest with your students and say, you know what, we're going to give this particular strategy a shot for 10 minutes or so, see how it goes, get some feedback for students, be a bit reflective on it. And if it does work, great, you could do it again in the future. If students enjoy it, great, you can do it again in the future. If it really doesn't seem to work, then maybe you could give it a miss or think about what went wrong or why it didn't work under that particular circumstance or with those students. So the one thing I did want to emphasize in this video, though, is not just to define learning by teaching, is to really try and explain why learning by teaching or any of these other variations, I guess you could call it, are effective. So what is it that makes teaching something a way in which acquiring concepts and knowledge and general understanding of a topic or a subject, what is it about teaching it that makes that happen in such an effective way? Now, if you've ever done any type of martial arts before, you'll know that as you go through the ranks or the grades or the belts, you do more and more teaching. And they do that for various different reasons. Sometimes it's just for a time type thing, but quite often it's because of the positive effects that learning by teaching has. And you would know that if you've ever tried to teach someone something to someone, that afterwards you generally feel like you have a much better understanding of that particular subject or topic or skill or whatever it is. And there are some reasons for that. So the first one is, the first reason, and well, not the first reason, there's no real order for these reasons. So I've just been trying to sort of figure them out. So I haven't come up with a system or some type of acronym or anything like that. This is just more of my own personal brainstorm as to why I think learning by teaching is effective. But by learning these reasons, it actually helps us implement this strategy in a much better way. So you'll notice that in all my teaching strategies and behaviour strategies, webinars and the things that I write, I always think about the pros. So what goes on and what happens? What are the steps in that process physiologically or physically? And what are the pros? What exactly happens with that strategy in particular that doesn't happen with other strategies? What's sort of going on? So learning by teaching is a very interesting one in that there's a lot of stuff happening and that happens in our brains that doesn't happen, or happens cognitively, I guess you could say, that doesn't happen with other more passive strategies, or even the less passive strategies where students are working one-on-one and they're sort of equals, because there is a bit of a, I guess, a power indifference here in a sense, or a knowledge, not indifference, difference, or a knowledge difference as well. So one of the first things that happens is that the student has to articulate. No, I'm not going to use that pen. Wait, is that? Sorry, my pen here is running out. Let's do another one actually. Gaps. Articulate. Okay, so here's just the first three. Well, here's three anyway. Maybe we'll put these in a more logical order afterwards. But again, it doesn't really matter. This isn't written to be in any particular order. So the first thing that the student needs to do, let's call it let's call that the MKO, sorry. So MKO comes from, if you see my other video on the zone of proximal development, in that strategy, or in that theory, I guess, we talk about the MKO, which stands for more knowledgeable other. So I'm going to use that term for this because that makes it easier than saying the student and the student, because that could be a little bit confusing. So the MKO needs to think about the different gaps of the actual individual, of the student, of the learner. So they need to think about the gaps of the learner, what they know, what they don't know, what their starting point is, and so on and so forth. So that leads me to another one, which is the goals. So they need to think about specifically what the goal or what the goals are for that particular activity, and that involves criteria that needs to be achieved. So some type of competency or criteria or standard. So in the mind of the MKO, they're thinking about now that I'm helping this learner, what standard do I want them to get to at the end? Or maybe what goals do we want to achieve? So depending on the topic, those might be the same thing or slightly different. So they have to set a goal, and they have to say, okay, let's say we're teaching a student how to, do a certain maths question, then the standard is that they can get most of them right, or they can get 8 out of 10 right, or they know how to do these basic things. If it's something more physical, which probably serves as a better example, if we're teaching a student, for example, how to change a bike tyre, then the end goal is quite obvious, that we want them to know the process, and we want them to be able to then get on their bike and to be able to ride the bike around knowing confidently that tyre doesn't have a slow leak or something like that. So an older student might be teaching a younger student how to change a bike tyre. The standard is not that they change it, it's that we are now confident that I could then ride that bike 5 kilometres up the road to the shops and back without being too worried that that particular tyre is then going to, by the time I get to the shops, it's going to have a slow leak and I'm going to have to walk my bike all the way home. So you've got some specific goals or criteria or standards in place. Now, the example I was using before is with martial arts. So depending on that individual, if say a black belt or a brown belt or whatever is teaching a white belt or a yellow belt or something, then that individual at those different levels will have slightly different goals. So even for the exact same task. So if in a school environment, if we're teaching a year 3 student, year 7 is teaching a year 3 student something, they will have a slightly different standard for what is expected, as opposed to if it was the year 7 student doing it themselves. There could be physical or gross motor or fine motor reasons for that. If it's a bike tyre, it might be the speed at which they can do it. So they might not be able to do it at the same rate. So they're your goals / criteria and standards. Now, as a part of that process, it's another one that just came to mind, strategies, before I forget it, because I want to talk about that one next. A part of that process, the more knowledgeable other will have to go through a bit of a mental or cognitive process to work out what the various different steps are in that actual task that they're doing. So if they're changing a bike tyre, the student is going to have, the more knowledgeable other is going to have to teach the learner how to go through it using steps. So they're going to have to use a strategy called chunking. They're going to have to use a few strategies actually. So you've got chunking, you've got scaffolding, and you've got whole part whole learning in this case. And we've got questions is another one. And summarize is another one. Self-assess is another one. Okay, so just to return to this one quickly, I'm just putting these down as they come to me. This steps here is an important part of the process, and one of the reasons for why learning by teaching, one of the main reasons why learning by teaching is so effective, and that's because that individual there has to divide things into different little chunks. So it can be a process or it can just be boxes. That's the worst box ever. So they might divide into little, I guess, sections of knowledge, or it can actually be some type of chronological process. And that's why I wrote whole part whole learning there, which is another video I've done. So look that one up, because changing a bike tyre, for example, that is modelling is another one. Changing a bike tyre, for example, is a task that would really lend itself to doing whole part whole learning, which is sort of a modelling at the start, then the student going, or the learner going through and learning it one aspect at a time, and so on and so forth. So anyway, the MKO will have to think about the process. They may know how to do it, but they've never actually broken it down into little steps. Now, when they break it down into little steps, they are then self-assessing what aspect of that task they're good at and what aspect of those individual tasks they're good at and which aspect they don't know much about, or that they have a little bit of some additional training or additional learning or research or something like that. So they may be really confident in showing the student that one, but not so sure there. So in that case, it leads the student, they're doing some self-assessment, and that happens, by the way, because of questions. Quite often that happens because of questions that the learner will ask. So the learner will say, but what about this, or what about that? And they start asking hypotheticals and really tricky questions about tiny little aspects of the task. And that can mean that the person who is then teaching this part, the more knowledgeable other, really has to think about all the little different aspects. So if we were to draw that in a way that is visually makes sense to us as we're thinking about this strategy. So that's the amount of knowledge, or that represents the amount of knowledge. Then there's all these different little bits of knowledge in there that is important, or that needs to be known to be able to do this particular aspect of it. And the learner might ask a question about that one little aspect of it. So then it forces some type of self-assessment by the MKO against that little bit there, and they have to stop and they have to actively think and reflect on and make links and so on and so forth. The other thing that happens with the process is that, oh, that's the same colour. The other thing that happens with the process is that the more knowledgeable other has to make links between here. So they have to identify the difference between the two and where one ends and where one starts and how you make that leap. They also have to assess progress and provide feedback. So they have to assess the progress of the student against these milestones here. So there's one there, there'll be another one there, there'll be another one there, and there's a final milestone at the very end. So that's where they reach that goal, which is to learn how to do it to a certain standard or against a certain criteria. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot to unpack and to think about. If we're teaching students how to use this as a strategy, if you want to use it in your regular day-to-day teaching or weekly teaching or whatever, think about, for example, if you're teaching reading and you're a teacher aide, you've got 4 or 5 students, and you don't want them to be constantly focused on you. You want the students to be able to teach each other certain different things, and you want to take advantage of all the different things that happens here. Think about how this can be used and why it's important. So if you're getting an older student to teach a younger student how to read, say, a level 2 book, then they'll need to be able to think about, okay, before we move from one page to the next, or before we move from level 2 to level 3, what do we need to know? What do we need to know to understand this particular page, this particular part of the story, before we turn the page and we start thinking about the next part of the story? So at this point here, they're making some type of self-assessment, not self-assessment, but they're making an assessment against the project or progress or their understanding and so forth. And they have to provide feedback. Not only do they have to provide feedback, but they have to articulate it in a way that makes sense. So they need to put it into words, explain it to the student, the learner. The learner's going to ask a bunch of questions, and then they're going to have to go through a bit of a teaching process there. One other thing that you can also do is teach those students, teach the more knowledgeable other, how to use various different strategies, because they're going to use strategies anyway, so you might as well teach them how to do it. Chunking is one of them. We've already gone through chunking there. Scaffolding, so that's helping the student in some way to do part of a task or the whole task by assisting them by putting some teaching or learning strategies in place. It could be a resource, it could be different demonstration, it could be doing part of it for the learner, and it could be doing 10% for the learner, it could be doing 50% of the learner. So that's called guided learning or shared learning. And we have whole part, whole learning, which is dividing a task into multiple steps and going through that process there. So that is the basics of why learning by teaching is effective. There are a couple of others that we can go through. Two main ones. So you've got consolidation and summarise. Now, both of those, or slash, I guess, review as well. And I also like the idea of these strategies here. I don't know if you can see that, is reflection. So reflection is also a type of self-assessment. Oh, I've already got summarise up the top there. There you go. So basically what happens is that towards the end here, the more knowledgeable other needs to go through a process of consolidation, as in ensuring that that student can do not only that, and providing feedback and identifying weaknesses and strengths and gaps and so on and so forth, but also being able to, at the end there, put it all together, which is a part of that whole process. It's also a part of the process of scaffolding as well, because scaffolding generally, according to the levels of instruction, starts with modelling or worked examples, guided learning, shared learning, the other way around, shared learning, guided learning, and then you get to independent learning. So you really want them to be able to do stuff here independently of the more knowledgeable other. So that's the end goal, that they can actually change their tyre independent of someone else being there with them. That doesn't mean they're not supervising for safety reasons or anything like that, but you'll have a certain goal. So with the younger students changing a tyre, the goal won't be that they get a flat tyre and they can change it completely on themselves. The goal will be that they kind of have an idea and a parent or someone can just supervise and help out where needed. It doesn't mean they can actually do the whole thing themselves. And there's also a bit of a summary, and that usually comes at the start of the activity, but also at the end of activity and the start of each of the different steps when the more knowledgeable other is articulating what specifically is going on. So they need to think about this part here, summarise it, and be able to explain it very simply in a very simple way so that the learner can understand it. And that can be quite difficult, because I've found, as far as teaching students, if you ask someone to summarise this page or summarise this chapter or summarise this activity, it sounds simple, but it's actually very, very difficult in an area where students really struggle, whether that's teaching adults, and particularly for adults. If you say summarise this chapter, a lot of adults really, really struggle to go through and do that process. So for students as well, being able to summarise in, say, 2 or 3 sentences, what's going on here, why it's important, why I've divided it up in this way, why we learn it in this stage, what standard you're expected to get at, the purpose of it, even the little steps within that, because there might be, here are the 3 things we do at this particular aspect, and so on and so forth. That summary is an important part of the process, and why it helps both the actual student or the learner to actually acquire new knowledge and to get to that point down there where they know how to do things independently, but also for the MKO, so for the person actually teaching the student, it helps them to consolidate in their own mind the various different steps and to fill the gaps and to self-assess. So the whole purpose of, I think I forgot to mention something really important here actually, the whole purpose of learning by teaching is not, it can be, but it's not for the actual learner to be able to develop the competency down here. That is not our main goal, unlike some of these things. I really should have mentioned this earlier, sorry. The whole purpose of learning by teaching, and the main reason we use it, there are secondary reasons, as I was saying, like peer tutoring and stuff. The main reason we use learning by teaching is for the MKO to develop their skills and knowledge and understanding. So the person that's teaching the learner, we're using this particular strategy so that person that's teaching the learner becomes really, really, really good and understands the processes and steps and goals and all the little tiny bits and pieces and so forth of that particular process. Now, obviously that's not always the case. If you've got an older student teaching a younger student, that's going to also help both. If you're doing the peer modelling thing, because that's more behaviour-wise, that doesn't really apply. But I would say 70% of the time, probably 80% of the time when I'm using learning by teaching, I'm actually thinking about the MKO, and it's sort of like almost like it helps to develop that overlearning, or what is also known as mastery learning, which I've also got some videos about, so feel free to watch those, because I actually think those are two really important strategies. So overlearning basically means if the standard is here, you're teaching the student way beyond that standard, way beyond what they need to know. So they're really mastering it. Mastery learning is more of a technical term or technical strategy where students generally have to score 90% or higher before they can move on to the next topic. So they can do something almost to a mastery level standard. That doesn't mean it's 100%. Whereas if that's, say they need 90%, you could think of overlearning like getting to 120%. So they're way past what they need to be able to do. Okay, so that's the basics of learning by teaching. Now again, this is just my idea here as far as some of the reasons for why learning by teaching is so effective. Not so much in terms of the learner, although that is important, but the learner could just as easily learn from a teacher or anyone else, right? But mainly for that MKO, so for that other student that you're pairing up with the learner. So, which I think for the majority of the time, that's why, well, for me personally, that's why I would be using learning by teaching. Whether you're using that in an adult environment or you're using it in a primary school or high school, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a teacher aide, trainer, whatever you're doing, even coaching, learning by teaching is a really effective instructional method, and I'd highly recommend playing around with it. The one other thing that I will just quickly mention, if you've noticed with all these different things, and I probably put them I probably could have done better as far as the order goes or whatever, but again, it doesn't really matter. This is really just a list of what good teaching looks like when you think about it. So you're articulating things very clearly and precisely and not using words or sentences that are more complicated than they need to be. You're dividing things into steps and processes and using various different teaching strategies. You've got clear goals and criteria, which quite often in schools are called learning outcomes or various different things. You're identifying gaps, so you're doing different types of formative assessment to figure out where the gaps are, where they're up to, how they could do better, whether they're moving in the right direction or not, and using that formative assessment to not only provide feedback but to do different strategies. So you might remodel it, you might use more worked examples, you might scaffold it down further or whatever, and so on and so forth. Summarising things, doing a review, consolidation at regular points, particularly the review. That's probably the most important part. Well, review and summarise, I guess, they're slightly different, but they are very similar. They're slightly different, but summarise is more so a term as far as in teaching strategies. In the teaching strategy world, summarise is more so associated with literacy and using text and things and summarising text and so forth. So that's probably a bad word to use, but certainly I use the word review a lot. So you've got reviews at the bookend of different activities. Now, a lot of these types of things, that MKO will go through and do a lot of these even without your help or without you telling them that you need to do this and do this and do this. But if you're using learning by teaching, they probably won't do it as effectively as they could. If you're using learning by teaching regularly as a tool or as a particular activity, it doesn't hurt to spend 5 minutes explaining a few of these things, particularly probably just making sure you say to students, explain things very clearly, short, sharp sentences, making sure that you're thinking about the various different steps and dividing it up into specific steps. We're going to learn this, then we're going to learn this, then we're going to learn this. Making sure that you address all the aspects of one step before you move on to the next step. Making sure that you do some type of review, conclusion, that type of thing at the very end, particularly against whatever your goals are. Making sure you have a very clear goal at the start. You can see how that very quickly leads that MKO to be able to develop their own teaching programs to be able to teach themselves. So in a way, learning by teaching is also a type of, I don't want to say it's a metacognitive skill, but it certainly helps students learn the process of learning so that they can then go on and do some self-directed learning in the future. So if they wanted to learn something outside of the school environment or continue their education or whatnot when there's no teacher around, then that more knowledgeable other, because they sort of understand all these different aspects, because you've helped articulate it and explain it to them. It might only take 3 or 4 minutes. This is how we teach people. What do you need to know? Here's a couple of things. Go off and teach those students your buddy how to read, or your buddy how to change a tyre or whatever. Then they'll be able to use those skills to teach themselves in the future. So that's learning by teaching, and some of the reasons for why learning by teaching is so effective. You don't have to include all of those in every single activity when you are doing learning by teaching, but it's really good to know why it's so effective, and physiologically and psychologically what happens in the brain, not physiologically, psychologically I guess, cognitively, what is happening in the brain as you're going through and teaching something, and why there is this phenomena of going through that process of teaching something and then having that feeling that you really have mastered it. Because it does force you to self-assess on what you're really good at and what you're not good at, and then you have to go and seek out ways of filling those gaps. So that's learning by teaching. Hello everyone again. Just one thing that I forgot to mention from my webinar on learning by teaching that I'm just going to chuck in at the end there, because I think it's pretty important, is that one way you can actually use learning by teaching yourself, or to even teach kids to use it, or adults or whoever, is by talking to a little furry friend, such as a teddy bear, or a dog, or a cat, or your friend, or parents, or siblings, or whoever. Learning by teaching doesn't always have to be something that you do only in a classroom. You can actually use it yourself to try and learn something. So it's a common strategy that really, not all teachers, but a lot of teachers show students how to do in high school when they're preparing for exams and things like that. So if you don't have a cat, or you don't have a dog, or you don't have someone that will listen to you while you try and teach them something that they really don't care about, then grab one of these, put them in front of you, and go through and try to teach them how to change a bike tire or whatever. Another really good way to use learning by teaching is getting kids to make things like YouTube videos or podcasts, or to write blogs or whatever. So it's the same principle in that they have to think about all these different things, how to divide it up into steps, how to explain it, putting a summary there, doing some type of whole part whole learning usually. They have to go through all those different aspects, thinking about what are the hard parts, what are the easy parts, what are the tricks, what are the areas where you could get stuck, what are the areas where you think are easy but are actually really difficult, so you've got to be aware of those. What are the little stories or anecdotes from their own experiences that they think are relevant that they should include in the limited time that they've got to teach that particular topic or subject or skill or whatever it is. So learning by teaching doesn't have to be in the classroom. It can be something that students do at home when they're preparing for a test or exam, or trying to just get good at something. You can make that a homework activity. Students can go home and teach their teddy bear how to read, or how to spell, or how to change a bike tire, or how to do cartwheels, or whatever it is. They could make YouTube videos. They could even write a blog or something like that. So anyway, that's my little bonus material, we'll call it, for this particular strategy. One of my favourite strategies, learning by teaching.